Good evening. Welcome to the Ernst Townsend Performing Arts Center. My name is Brian Stinak, and I am the orchestra director for the Norwalk City Schools. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our annual Orchestra Festival concert. This concert is a little unique in that it is orchestra only. We showcase the fact that we have a thriving orchestra program in the Norwalk City School District. So we have every grade level from grade 6 through 12, through the beginning stages of playing to the most advanced. And on our stage right now is our very large 6th grade orchestra. This is their first year playing. This is their first concert. They may be a little bit nervous, but they are going to do an amazing job. Now, I know what you're thinking, first year players, you're probably wondering what we might sound like. You might think that it can sound a little like this. And that concludes our portion of the concert. But actually, with just a little bit of practice, we sound a lot more like this. So playing an instrument, any instrument, but particularly a stringed instrument, there are so many things to remember and to work on and practice. It's a journey, it's a process, and there are many different techniques that students have to learn. The first thing that they really learn how to play is how to make a good sound by plucking the strings. It's a technique called pizzicato. The next few songs that we play will be played pizzicato. After mastering some things with pizzicato, it's time to move on to learn how to use the bow, learn more notes on our instruments, and also how to begin reading music. These students, and all of our students performing tonight, reading music is a lot like reading another language. And so they're doing a phenomenal job, and our next few songs are good examples of just that. they've learned a lot since that first sound, haven't they? It's really wonderful to hear the progress. So what we've been playing so far has been what we say unison. So everything is the same note at the same time by each person in the orchestra. Well, we're about to play our first orchestra arrangement. So what I mean by that is there are 5 different parts that are being played all at once. We have 2 separate violin parts, a viola part, a cello, and a bass part, but they all have to come together and sound really good. So based on their D major scale, this is first scale march. Correction. It is not first scale march yet. It is Frere Jacques, where we go into harmonized playing. I had that hit myself. So, anyway, they say yes. Okay, here is Frere Jacques. And now, first scale march. Well, this brings us literally to the end of our portion of the concert. Before we go, I would just ask you if you would, in their very first concert, would you say that they did an amazing job? So as they say on TV, wait, there's more. Because this would not be a proper orchestra concert without these, one fiddle tune. So we're going to fiddle our way out of here with Cabbage. Okay, so what we're going to do, you can play the cello or the bass in your end pin. We're going to put it back behind the blackbird where you guys found it earlier today, the bridge against the wall. If you are a viola or a violin player, make sure you have everything. Okay, I think we're ready to go. So ladies and gentlemen, here is our 7th grade orchestra. this portion of the program as well. You'll notice the size of the 6th grade group was pretty good sized. Our 7th grade group is also very good sized. In fact, when we combine 6th, 7th, and 8th graders in orchestra altogether, there are over 100 students that are participating. And that's a wonderful situation in which to be. And when we combine that with our high school people who will be playing later today, when you combine all of those numbers, it's like 185 altogether who are involved in orchestra. So that's a great thing, but the not so good thing is that we won't all fit on the stage at the same time. So unlike in years past, I do apologize that we will not have a combined number because we just won't fit. So I do hope that you understand that, but here's the trade-off for that. Our music boosters who provide a reception at the end of the concert every year, and they've done so again this year over in the art gallery. We'll just get to the food one song quicker. How's that? Okay, so thank you so much for your understanding. We're going to finish off with our final one. This one is entitled Fiddles on Fire, but please understand that's just the title. Nobody's instrument is going to be igniting as far as we know. So we should be good to go. The fire suppression system won't go off or anything like that. Fiddles on Fire. cello or the bass. You're going to put your end pin in, and you're going to go back behind the black curtain. Put your cello or bass safely against the wall with the bridge facing it. If you are a violin or viola player, you're going to have all your stuff with you. We're going to go down this set of stairs. We're going to sit in this center aisle right there. Ava is running frantically to remove the tape. Anna is on the other side. Look at that teamwork, everybody. All right, so let's go ahead. Thank you so much for your patience. We're in tune. We're ready to go. Ladies and gentlemen, this is from our 8th grade at Norwalk Middle School, our advanced orchestra. bring us to our last number as well. What I would like to do though, before we play it, is I would like to recognize some students that back in January, which seems like a long time ago, but really it wasn't, they participated in and represented Norwalk Middle School very, very well in the Ohio Music Education Association District 2 Honors Music Festival, which was hosted at Tiffin Middle School. So could I have our Honors Festival students, would you please stand and be recognized? That was a really great event, and they did a fabulous job in not only playing there, but representing themselves in our school district very, very well. And in fact, our last number comes from that festival. It's a student favorite, and it is entitled Turbulence. On stage with us now is our Norwalk High School Orchestra. Now, you probably noticed a few additional instruments that go along with our very large string section. We have a full complement of woodwind, brass, and percussion instruments to make up what is known as a full orchestra. So our first number was full orchestra with Verdi's Anvil Chorus. How many of you ever heard that piece before? You know what I'm talking about? Okay, great. And then this last one is a strings-only piece, and it's entitled Midnight Rain. It's definitely a student favorite. And we're going to continue with another strings-only piece. And this one is going to pay homage to the St. Patrick's Day celebration that we just had earlier this week. So this one is entitled Celtic Fiddle Tune. to say, maybe you don't want to hear me talk anyway, and that would be fine. But anyway, this brings us to our final piece of the concert. So before we go much further with that piece, I want to just acknowledge a few individuals. We had some folks who went to Ohio Music Education Association District 2 Solo and Ensemble Contest. I'd like those string players, as I call you, to be recognized. So would you please stand? Henry Dyga, Natalie Morales Roblero, Logan Migro, Chloe Rogers, Anna Copsey, Ava Copsey, and Brooke Hyman. We can get that. They also did a phenomenal job at that adjudicated event. Oh, and by the way, speaking of Brooke Hyman, Brooke, would you please stand? Perfect ACT score. The only one in Norwalk High School history. Pretty impressive. You know, there's a lot of people that I included in your digital program that I wish to thank. So I would just ask you to peruse that. There are so many, because without everyone who works behind the scenes, who works at an administrative capacity, to a staff member, a custodian, there are just so many people, transportation, getting 6th and 7th and 8th graders here today to practice. It was just, I can't believe it all happened like clockwork, and it did. So we're very grateful for all the support we have. The short list, I'd just like to thank our Board of Education, our administration, our faculty and staff at each of the 3 schools that are represented here today, our music department, our EPAC staff, and of course, all of our orchestra parents. So again, we have a huge orchestra program here at Norwalk. Not every school has that, and it's wonderful that we do. We also have the full orchestra experience for our high schoolers as well. So can we give every student who is performing tonight one more round of applause? Okay, so before we go over to the art gallery and enjoy the festivities of our music boosters, that's another group I wish to acknowledge. Headed up at Liz Burr, the music boosters do a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes, such as providing food for our students, such as providing the polos that you see the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders wearing. They do not have to shell out any money for concert wear. The boosters provide that for them. And it's just a great thing they do, and not only for our group, but for band, for orchestra, choir, grades 6 through 12. So in your program, please make sure that you take a look at how to become a music booster and be a part of a great organization. All right now we're going to go on to our last piece of music written by Beethoven. It is a piece of intrigue. There is war, conflict, there is liberty and victory portrayed. There's imprisonment and even, yes, a beheading portrayed in the music. So without further ado, we like to say Beethoven was ahead of his time. And that's why I'm not quitting my day job. Without further ado, here is Count Egmont Overture by Beethoven.